Jayam Vishnupad Paramahamsa Parivrajagacharya Asto Tarasata Sri Srimad Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Maharaj Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Anantakoti Vaishnava Vrinda Ki Jai. Nam Acharya Srila Haridas Thakur Ki Jai. Prem Sikaho Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhar Sri Vas Adi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Ki Jai. Shri Radha Krishna Gopa Gopinath Shamakunda Radha Kund Giri Govardhan Ki Jai. Vrindavan Dham Ki Jai. Navadvip Dham Ki Jai. Ganga Mai Yamuna Mai Ki Jai. Bhakti Devi Tulsi Maharani Ki Jai. Samaveda Bhakta Vrinda Ki Jai. Gaura Premanandi. All glories to the assembled devotees.
Hare Krishna.
All glories to the assembled devotees.
Hare Krishna.
All glories to the assembled devotees.
Hare Krishna.
All glories to the lotus feet of Sri Sri Guru and Sri Gauranga. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate
Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Namo
Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Hare Krishna. Good morning. Welcome, everybody. Today, we continue our study of Srimad Bhagavatam. We're in the first canto, the 18th chapter, and today's text is number 22. Yatranukarta saha saivadhira vyapo yat dehadishu sangam udham vrajanti tat paramahansyam antyam yasmin ahimso pasama svadharmaha yatranurakta saha saivadhira vyapohya dehadishu sangam udham vrajanti tat paramahamsyam antyam yasmin ahimso pasama svadharmaha yatranurakta sahasaiva dhira vyapohyat dehadishu sangam udham vrajanti tat paramahamsyam antyam yasmin ahimso pasama svadharmaha. Please chant.
Hare Krishna. Yatra nuraktaha sahaseva dhira vyapoya deha dishu sangamuram vrajanti tat paramahansyam antyam yasmin enso pashamaha swadharmaha.
Yatra nusakta sahasaiva dhira vyapohya dehadishu sangamudham vrajanti tat parama hamsayam antyam yasmin ahimso pasama swadharma.
Hare Krishna. Yatro nuraktaha sahaseva dhira vyapya dehadeshu sangam udham vrajanti tat paramahamsam antyam yasmin ahimsho pasamaha swadharmaha.
Hare Krishna Prabhu. Jatra nurukta sahasaiva dhira व्यापः देहेदिषु सङ्गम् उडाम् व्रजन्ति तत्परमा संशयम् अन्तायम् यस्मिन् हिंसा पसमास धर्मा.
Anyone else? Okay. Yatra, unto whom, anuraktaha, firmly attached. Sahasa, all of a sudden. Eva, certainly. Dhiraha, self-controlled. Vyapohya, leaving aside. Deha, the gross body and subtle mind. Adishu, relating to. Sangam, attachment. Udham, taken to. Vrajanti, go away. Tat, that. Paramahansyam, the highest stage of perfection. Antyam, and beyond. Oh, and beyond that. Yasmin, in which. Ahimsa, non-violence. Upashamaha, and renunciation. Svadharmaha, consequential occupation. Translation by Srila Prabhupada. Self-controlled persons who are attached to the Supreme Lord, Sri Krishna, can all of a sudden give up the world of material attachment, including the gross body and subtle mind, and go away to attain the highest perfection of the renounced order of life, by which non-violence and renunciation are consequential. Purport. Only the self-controlled can gradually be attached to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Self-controlled means not indulging in sense enjoyment more than is necessary. And those who are not self-controlled are given over to sense enjoyment. Dry philosophical speculation is a subtle sense enjoyment of the mind. Sense enjoyment leads one to the path of darkness. Those who are self-controlled can make progress on the path of liberation from the conditional life of material existence. The Vedas, therefore, enjoin that one should not go on the path of darkness, but should make a progressive march toward the path of light or liberation. Self-control is actually achieved not by artificially stopping the senses from material enjoyment, but by becoming factually attached to the Supreme Lord by engaging one's unalloyed senses in the transcendental service of the Lord. The senses cannot be forcibly curbed, but they can be given proper engagement. Purified senses, therefore, are always engaged in the transcendental service of the Lord. This perfectional stage of sense engagement is called Bhakti Yoga. So those who are attached to the means of Bhakti Yoga are factually self-controlled and can all of a sudden give up their homely or bodily attachment for the service of the Lord. This is called the Paramahansa stage. Hangsas, or swans, accept only milk out of a mixture of milk and water. Similarly, those who accept the service of the Lord instead of Maya's service are called Paramahansas. They are naturally qualified with all the good attributes such as pridelessness, freedom from vanity, non-violence, tolerance, simplicity, respectability, worship, devotion, and sincerity. All these godly qualities exist in the devotee of the Lord spontaneously. Such Paramahamsas, who are completely given up to the service of the Lord, are very rare. They are very rare even amongst the liberated souls. Real nonviolence means freedom from envy. In this world, everyone is envious of his fellow being, but a perfect Paramahamsa, being completely given up to the service of the Lord, is perfectly non-envious. He loves every living being in relation with the Supreme Lord. Real renunciation means perfect dependence on God. Every living being is dependent on someone else because he is so made. Actually, everyone is dependent on the mercy of the Supreme Lord, but when one forgets his relation with the Lord, he becomes dependent on the conditions of material nature. Renunciation means renouncing one's dependence on the conditions of material nature and thus becoming completely dependent on the mercy of the Lord. Real independence means complete faith in the mercy of the Lord without dependence on the conditions of matter. This Paramahamsa stage is the highest perfectional stage in Bhakti Yoga, the process of devotional service to the Supreme Lord. The translation again. Self-controlled persons who are attached to the Supreme Lord Sri Krishna can all of a sudden give up the world of material attachment, including the gross body and subtle mind, and go away to attain the highest perfection of the renounced order of life, by which nonviolence and renunciation are consequential. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prastaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swami Tinamane Namaste Saraswate Devi Gauravani Pacharni Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarne Om Ajnana Timirandasya Jnanam Jnana Shalakaya Chakshur Unmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Vanchakalpa Trubhya Chakrapa Sindubhya Eva Chapatitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Hare Krishna. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining. Today's purport, Srila Prabhupada's purport, is so perfect. And there's so much in there. Oftentimes when we read Srila Prabhupada's purports, we can read them over and over again. And we talked about this in the previous weeks, how Shastra, that's just the nature of Shastra. You can read it over and over and over again, and it becomes ever fresh. There's always something new to learn, no matter how many times you read through it. So when I was going through today's purport, I noticed that Srila Prabhupada, as he often does, he very intricately describes the concepts that we're dealing with here. And he does so in such a way that he wants to make sure that we actually understand what's being spoken about before he moves on to the next area. So what I'm going to do first is we're going to read through the purport again, line by line, and I'm just going to point out a few of these things. And then after that, since today on the calendar it says it's the disappearance of Sri Ramananda Roy, we're going to talk about some of his pastimes, and they actually relate to what we're talking about in today's purport. So it's a very nice, smooth transition. So first, what I'll do. So first sentence of the purport. Only the self-controlled can gradually be attached to the Supreme Personality of Godhead, right? So here's a statement, right? This is what we call a thesis. Only the self-controlled can gradually be attached to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So first off, if we want to be attached to the Supreme Personality of Godhead, which we hopefully do, but we'll get more to that later in this purport, then one has to A, be self-controlled, and B, with that self-control, that can allow one to gradually be attached to the personality of Godhead. It's not that just with self-control comes attachment to the personality of Godhead. There's this gradual process that one has to redirect one's consciousness. So we'll get more to that. So with this thesis statement, only the self-control can gradually be attached to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. This is this is showing us that if, like I said, if we want to be attached to the Supreme Personality of Godhead, first we have to start with self-control. Then we can worry about what happens with the gradual part. So the next sentence naturally is saying what self-controlled means, because we do want to be attached to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Second sentence, self-controlled means not indulging in sense enjoyment more than is necessary. Now, notice it doesn't say self-controlled means not indulging in sense enjoyment. It says more than is necessary, because it is necessary in order to maintain the body to engage in some sense enjoyment. We have to eat, otherwise the body will die. We have to sleep, otherwise the body can't re-energize itself. If anyone has ever tried to stay up for a very, very long time without sleeping at all, they know that the body starts doing these very strange things. You even start hallucinating. You don't see things clearly. So these things are necessary to an extent. So self-controlled means not indulging in sense enjoyment more than is necessary. So we have to know, okay, what is necessary sense enjoyment and what is unnecessary sense enjoyment, right? The next sentence, those who are not self-controlled are given over to sense enjoyment. So those who don't have this self-control, only engaging in sense enjoyment when is necessary, they're given over to sense enjoyment. In other words, they can't focus on self-realization. They're more focused on sense enjoyment, right? If we're not self-controlled. Then, so far, it sounds like we're just talking about gross sense enjoyment, right? It's talking about self-control and it's talking about sense enjoyment. And those who are not self-controlled, they give over to sense enjoyment. So since the verse is talking about the gross body and the subtle mind, Srila Prabhupada wants to point out that self-controlled doesn't just mean self-controlled from gross sense enjoyment, but also from mental sense enjoyment. So the next sentence, dry philosophical speculation is a subtle sense enjoyment of the mind. So this is still sense enjoyment. It's different. So karma and jnana, they're both sense enjoyment. One's gross, one's subtle. Then sense enjoyment leads one to the path of darkness, right? So now Srila Prabhupada is showing that first, like I said, that thesis is only the self-controlled can gradually be attached to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. What self-control means, and he does it in a comprehensive way, not just gross enjoyment, but also the subtle sense enjoyment. And if one is not self-controlled, they're given over to that sense enjoyment, and it leads one to the path of darkness, right? Then the next sentence, so that's the negative aspect. Then you have the positive aspect. Those who are self-controlled can make progress on the path of liberation from the conditional life of material existence. So those who aren't self-controlled, they follow the path of darkness. They're given over to sense enjoyment, and that's all they're absorbed in. And those who are self-controlled can make progress on the path of liberation from conditional life and material existence. So we can actually transcend that only if we're self-controlled. Then, of course, now Srila Prabhupada wants to give the authority of these statements, right? Because one might say, all right, well, this makes sense, it's logical, but where is it coming from, right? So then the next sentence, the Vedas therefore enjoin that one should not go on the path of darkness, but should make a progressive march toward the path of light or liberation, right? So now we have authorized scriptures that also back up these statements, that if you follow the path of darkness, you're going to remain in the material world perpetually. But if you follow the path of light or liberation, then one can actually properly engage in Krishna's service and return to our eternal state, right? So now that we have that established, right, we shouldn't follow the path of darkness, we should follow the path of light. So now we want to know more about self-control, because we know the general definition up top. Self-controlled means not indulging in sense enjoyment more than necessary. But now we want to know not just what it is, but how we attain it, right? So then Srila Prabhupada continues. Self-control is actually achieved not by artificially stopping the senses from material enjoyment, but by becoming factually attached to the Supreme Lord by engaging one's unalloyed senses in the transcendental service of the Lord. So that's a long one, long sentence, and there's a lot in there. So first, Srila Prabhupada wants to point out that we're not interested in Paugul Vairagya. That means artificially giving something up. And you may have intentions when you artificially give something up. You may read in the Vedas, or you may hear from a senior devotee that attachment to a particular object is not ideal for our Krishna conscious growth. And so we may, like I said, either in the Vedas or from another sadhu or from the guru, we may hear that it's best to give up certain things. If we give up these things artificially, in other words, if we put the thing to the side physically, but we're still mentally attached to it, and we don't try to sever that mental attachment to it, then that's what's called Paugul Vairagya. We're not really detached from the thing. We're just temporarily, physically putting it to the side, but still internally we're meditating on it. So unless we are able to redirect that consciousness from the reason why I was attracted to that particular thing that I just gave up, at least physically, was because I like the way that it serves me. I like the way that it makes me feel. I like something that it does for me. And we have to redirect that consciousness that anything that we appreciate, we have to appreciate in the context of the Supreme Lord, right? So then the next part of that sentence, so it's not achieved by artificially stopping the senses from sense enjoyment, but by becoming factually attached to the Supreme Lord by engaging one's unalloyed senses in the transcendental service of the Lord. So this word unalloyed senses, or sorry, this group of words, unalloyed senses, this seems strange to us, right? Because generally when we hear about the senses, they're pretty much our enemies, right? They're dragging us in all these directions. And they're basically not our friends. So to hear this, to have this qualifier before it, unalloyed, it may seem counterintuitive, right? From what we're used to thinking of the senses, right? Usually the senses are the things that are pulling us away from devotional service. But here we're learning that you can engage one's unalloyed senses in the transcendental service of the Lord. So what this means is that the senses, when they're engaged in materialism or engaged in collecting the things, but with the intention of personal enjoyment, ourselves in the center, then those are the material senses that are taking us away from actually being engaged in Krishna's service and being attached to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. But when we practice this self-control that the beginning of the purport's talking about, then these senses become purified, right? And purified senses, purified means you take all of the materialism out of those, and then you are left with unalloyed senses, right? So the senses are still there, but since they're purified, instead of trying to enjoy things for our own pleasure, we're trying to use, the senses are trying to engage all of the things the way that they're meant to be engaged in Krishna's service. So when one engages these purified or unalloyed senses in the transcendental service of the Lord, then one can become attached to the Supreme Lord. Right. Then again, Srila Prabhupada wants to make sure that we understand that the senses cannot be forcibly curbed, but they can be given proper engagement. So we can't just, try to give something up physically without dealing with that mental attachment that we have. We have to understand the proper engagement, which is, instead of this being something for my pleasure, this is for Krishna's pleasure. Idam Krishnaya, idam namama. This is for Krishna, this is not for me, right? So this is what we have to know. Then, Srila Prabhupada continues, purified senses, therefore, are always engaged in the transcendental service of the Lord. Right? So this is what this means. This is what unalloyed senses means. It means the purified senses that are always engaged in the transcendental service of the Lord. They're not engaged in the service of making us feel comfortable or entertained or anything like that. They're strictly for the service of the Lord. right? And this perfectional stage, Srila Prabhupada continues, of sense engagement is called bhakti yoga, right? So bhakti yoga is just engaging the senses properly, right? So it's not ignoring the senses, but making sure that they're doing the right thing. So, continuing. So those who are attached to the means of bhakti yoga are factually self-controlled and can all of a sudden give up their homely or bodily attachment for the service of the Lord. This is called the Paramahamsa stage, right? So this is referring to that first bit of the translation about how self-controlled persons who are attached to the Supreme Lord can all of a sudden give up the world of material attachment and go away to attain the highest perfection of the renounced order of life, right? So that's called the Paramahamsa stage. So then we have this analogy of how swans are able to, if you give them a mixture of milk and water, they're able to separate it and just take the milk. And so similarly, the devotees are meant to be able to see the spirit in everything and disregard the materialism in everything. So everything is made from Krishna. Everything is Brahman. There's nothing that exists that is not Krishna. Everything is part of Krishna. So if we can see how each thing we're dealing with is actually a part of Krishna and how it is to be used accordingly, then we are in Krishna consciousness. But when we see these things and we're seeing just basically how they affect us, how they serve us, how they can be used to make us, again, either comfortable or entertained or give us shelter. Like, for example, I was going to give class outside today, but right before I was going to start, it started raining, so came inside. So when we see these things and if we're just thinking of how it's serving me, okay, well, it would serve me nicely to be outside because it's beautiful out there, but since it's raining now, it serves me better to be in here. If we're just thinking in terms of ourselves and not seeing Krishna in these things, then we're not on that Paramahamsa stage, right? So this is how we have to see how to, as is given in the analogy, when there's this mix of matter and spirit, right, which is everything around us, we're in the material world, but there's spirit in everything. And when we can see the spirit in everything, see how everything is coming from Krishna, appreciate it in that way, and then use it properly, then that's called bhakti yoga. So, and then it's mentioning that the Paramahamsas are very rare, even among liberated souls. So there are liberated souls, and then there are Paramahamsas who are actually understand that everything is meant to be engaged in Krishna service, right? Then, since the translation talks about non-violence and renunciation, means they come along, they're concomitant factors. When one is engaged in bhakti, these qualities automatically come. So Srila Prabhupada will define what non-violence actually means. So he says, real non-violence means freedom from envy. So this is a great sentence. So oftentimes, when Srila Prabhupada defines non-violence, you can look these up in Bhagavad Gita and elsewhere. He does this frequently, actually. When he defines nonviolence, generally, when we think of nonviolence, we think of it in terms of, mostly nonviolence towards animals. So we have a nonviolent diet, for example. We don't kill animals to get our nutrition. So we consider that a big part of nonviolence, but also to other living entities, not causing them harm, right? So, but Srila Prabhupada would take that further, and he would say, nonviolence, you don't want to cause them harm, but that means you want to do them the ultimate good. So Srila Prabhupada would point out that if you have knowledge of Krishna consciousness, and you don't present that to everyone you see, you're actually committing violence against them because you have something that they are desperately searching for and they desperately need. It is their very nature to understand Krishna consciousness, and you have it. And so if you're not giving it to them, that means you're being violent, or you're also being envious, because you're thinking, it's a subtle envy. You're thinking, well, I have this, and I don't want to give it. I don't want to give it to someone else. We don't think they deserve it, or we don't think they're ready for it, or whatever the case may be. But this is what real nonviolence means. So Srila Prabhupada often points this out. He continues, in this world, everyone is envious of his fellow being, right? We see people, they have something that we want, and we're envious. Oh, I wish I had that, or that. He's so lucky to be born in this situation that he can, do this or that or the other thing, right? This is a common in the material world. Continuing, but a perfect Paramahamsa, being completely given up to the service of the Lord, is perfectly non-envious, right? If everything we do is just for the service of the Lord, then there's nothing to be envious about. We understand that everything belongs to Krishna. We understand that he allows others to temporarily possess these certain qualities, and that devotees actually have these qualities concomitantly when they engage in Krishna service. So there's no point in being envious, because a devotee knows that A, everything belongs to Krishna, and B, Krishna is in control of everything. So nothing can be happening around us that isn't sanctioned by the Supreme Lord. So therefore, there's no point in envy. There's nothing that we need that we don't have, because Krishna is providing everything, and he's giving everything to everyone. So there's a reason each person has what they have. No need to be envious. Continuing, he loves every living being in relation with the Supreme Lord. That's the important part, in relation with the Supreme Lord, right? So sambandha means to know the relation between the living entities, the infinitesimal parts and parcels, and the Supreme Lord, the complete whole, the absolute truth, right? And then to act accordingly. So if we have this sambandha of who we are and who Krishna is and what the relationship is, and then we also know the other living entities also have this relationship with the Supreme Lord, then there's no envy, right? So it's just a cooperative love, right? So continuing, real renunciation, because it was talking about nonviolence and renunciation. So now we're learning what actual renunciation means. Real renunciation means perfect dependence on God, right? Again, sometimes when we hear the word renunciation, we think, okay, that means we're just giving up, material things. But giving up material things doesn't necessarily mean that we're depending on God, right? We can pass something to the side and so-called give it up, but if that's all we're doing, if we're not actually making that positive connection, then it's not true renunciation. So there's this concept of people. So here we are, we're spirit souls, we're in this material world, and it's unnatural because spirit souls by nature are eternal, and this material world is temporary. So it's uncomfortable, right? It's not familiar. It doesn't make any sense. So to not want to be here in the material world, it's good, right? And to renounce the material world, it's good, but it's not complete until we actually know where we do belong. We know we don't belong here. Okay, that's good, but that's pretty easy to figure out. It's very uncomfortable here. It's not meant for eternal beings. So that's only part of the realization. But the next part of the realization is, okay, I don't belong here, but where do I actually belong? Well, I belong in the spiritual world, and I am a servant of Krishna. I have to understand what that relationship is. And I have to understand that I am actually dependent on God, right? And that's real renunciation. So Srila Prabhupada continues, every living being is dependent on someone else because he is so made, right? That's just the nature. Continuing, actually, everyone is dependent on the mercy of the Supreme Lord, but when one forgets his relation with the Lord, again, sambandha, he becomes dependent on the conditions of material nature. So either way, we're dependent on something, right? Factually, we're dependent on the Supreme Lord by nature. That's the relation, the sambandha. But when we forget that, then we become dependent on the conditions of the material nature. So Srila Prabhupada continues that renunciation means renouncing one's dependence on the conditions of material nature, and thus becoming completely dependent on the mercy of the Lord. So renunciation, again, is just that shift in consciousness from being self-centric to being God-centric, right? Real independence means complete faith in the mercy of the Lord without dependence on the conditions of matter. This Paramahamsa stage is the highest perfectional stage in Bhakti Yoga, the process of devotional service to the Supreme Lord. So I just love how Srila Prabhupada did that, how he takes these ideas and then he makes sure that we know exactly what they mean, that we're not just glossing over it and saying, okay, you have to be self-controlled. Well, what does self-controlled actually mean? And then how does one become self-controlled? Because otherwise, we just imagine that self-controlled means they're not being drugged or dragged around by their senses. But we can see people who are fairly what we would consider self-controlled, but they're not actually connected positively to the Supreme Lord. They're disconnected from some of the negative aspects of the material world, and we look up to that and we say, oh, that's quite nice. It's honorable and noble. But we see that positive connection isn't there yet. And that positive connection is the most important thing. If we don't have that positive connection, then at best we're just being pious in this material world. Maybe, like the impersonalists, they're able to merge into the Brahmajyoti for some period of time. But since the soul is always active and there's no activity going on there, they come back down to the material world, as Srila Prabhupada pointed out, to perform humanitarian activities like open hospitals or feed hungry people, etc. And then the cycle continues. So until we actually have that positive engagement, we understand what our sambandha is and can actually properly engage, then we're not actually getting out completely of the material world. We're not actually entering into the spiritual world. So today, being the disappearance of Sri Ramananda Roy, I'm going to read first from the purport of Adi Leela 10:134. So in the Adi Leela, there are several chapters that describe what's known as the Chaitanya tree. So Lord Chaitanya's associates are described in those chapters, and in the purports, so all of the different associates are mentioned by name, and then in those purports, we really get to know each of these associates of Lord Chaitanya. It's one of those sections where it's such an important section. When we're going through it initially, it seems like a lot, because it's like, have you ever gone someplace new and you had to meet like hundreds of people and you're trying to like keep their names straight and what they've done? And it's a very difficult thing to do. So the first time we go through these chapters, it may seem daunting because we're learning about new people and we're hearing, about their character and their activities, and it's hard to keep it all straight, right? But then as we go through Chaitanya Charitamrita, then we start seeing Lord Chaitanya having the transaction with these devotees, but in context, right? And so if we understand what their character is before we see these pastimes, and then understand, oh, okay, I remember reading about him back here, and so this is, and then that pastime then makes more sense because we already understand the mood and character of these devotees. So sometimes what I like to do is when I get to these pastimes, I read about these devotees, and then I actually flip back to these chapters in Adi Leela, and I just get that gloss over to really, remind myself, who exactly is this person? And then so we get this, in a nutshell, basically their whole lives, and we get an idea of their character. And then from there, it's just, we understand the mood then much better than just reading a story about, two characters interacting. We actually get the mood and we understand why things are the way they are. Because sometimes Lord Chaitanya would behave what would appear externally to be differently with different types of devotees. Sometimes he was more strict, and sometimes he was more lenient. But there were reasons for this. And so if we understand this, then we see why sometimes Lord Chaitanya appeared to be more strict, and sometimes he appeared to be more lenient.
So,
So-
Prabhu, did you say Adi 1034 or
Adi 10:134. Yes.
Adi 10:134?
Yes.
Oh, 134. Okay.
Oh, sorry. It may have sounded like I said 34, but yeah. Chaitanya Charitamrita has very long chapters, so sometimes there's 400 or even more verses in one chapter. So I'm just going to read this part of this. So the Gaura Ganadesh Deepika 120 to 24. So those of you who don't know, the Gaura Ganadesh Deepika is written by Kavi Karnapur. Kavi Karnapur was a son of Shivananda Sen, another one of Lord Chaitanya's associates. He would bring the devotees from Navadvip to Jagannath Puri, and he was in charge of making sure everyone was able to get on the ferries and had a place to stay and had plenty to eat, etc. So one of his sons knew Lord Chaitanya since he was a baby. Lord Chaitanya actually gave him his name. Kavi Karnapur was named after Paramananda Puri. And so he was Puri Das for a while, and then he became known as Karnapur, right? So Gauragana Deshdipika is written by this devotee, Kavi Karnapur, and it explains who the devotees in Chaitanya Leela are in Krishna Leela, because when Krishna comes and performs his pastimes, his associates come with him. So this book shows us or informs us who these different people in Chaitanya Leela are in Krishna Leela. Pardon me. So the Gauragana Deshdipika states that Ramananda Roy was formerly Arjuna. So Bhavananda Roy was his father. He had 5 sons. Ramananda Roy is one of them. And so Lord Chaitanya considered them the 5 Pandavas, the 5 brothers. They were the 5 Pandavas. And then he is also considered to have been an incarnation of the Gopi Lalita, although in the opinion of others, he was an incarnation of Vishaka Devi. Right. So this bit we'll actually learn about. I'll actually just read. I was going to say it, but we'll just read it in the next paragraph where it says, in Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's final pastimes, Ramananda Roy and Swarup Damodar always engaged in reciting suitable verses from Srimad Bhagavatam and other books to pacify the Lord's ecstatic feelings of separation from Krishna. Right. So in this regard, he was in the mood of a gopi, a very intimate gopi. So some say Lalita, some say Vishaka, depending on the mood. They would comfort Srimati Radharani, and they would facilitate wherever her mood was taking her. They would facilitate that mood by encouraging her in that way. So Ramananda Roy and Swarup Damodar, in the same way, when Lord Chaitanya was feeling a certain way, they would chant verses from Srimad Bhagavatam and other scriptures, and to enhance that mood, and sometimes to bring him back from a particular mood if he was, too absorbed and they were trying to bring him back. Then they would do that. So he's simultaneously the mood of Arjuna and also in the mood of the intimate gopi friend. Then, when Lord Chaitanya went to southern India, Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya advised him to meet Ramananda Roy, declaring that there was no devotee as advanced in understanding the conjugal love of Krishna and the gopis. While touring South India, Lord Chaitanya met Ramananda Roy by the bank of the Godavari, and in their long discourses, the Lord took the position of a student, and Ramananda Roy instructed him. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu concluded these discourses by saying, "My dear Ramananda Roy, both you and I are madmen, and therefore we met intimately on an equal level." Lord Chaitanya advised Ramananda Roy to resign from his government post and come back to Jagannath Puri to live with him. Although Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu refused to see Maharaj Prataparudra because he was a king, Ramananda Roy, by a Vaishnava scheme, arranged a meeting between the Lord and the king. This is described in the Madhya Lila, chapter 12, verses 41 through 57. So this is just giving a summary of these different. We could talk for hours about all of these different transactions, but we'll keep going through and get the general idea. Sri Ramananda Roy was present during the water sports of the Lord after the Rath Yatra festival. Lord Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu considered Ramananda Roy and Sri Sanatana Goswami to be equal in their renunciation. For although Sri Ramananda Roy was a grihasta engaged in government service, and Sri Sanatana Goswami was in the renounced order of complete detachment from material activities, they were both servants of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who kept Krishna in the center of all their activities. Goes back to what we were talking about in today's verse. How sometimes externally it can look different, but internally that's what's the most important part. So, so Krishna in the center of all their activities. Sri Ramananda Roy was one of the 3.5 personalities with whom Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu discussed the most confidential topics of Krishna consciousness. So sometimes this surprises people, because how is there such a thing as a half a person? So does anyone know who the 3.5 personalities are?
I don't know the name, but one of them was a woman.
Mm-hmm.
I cannot remember.
Madhavi Devi. She's Sikhi Mahiti's sister. So there were Swarup Damodar, Ramananda Roy, who we just heard about, when they would help Lord Chaitanya by chanting particular verses. So they're very intimate associates. There was also Sikhi Mahiti, and then his sister Madhavi Devi. And so sometimes when we hear Madhavi Devi being described as half a person, sometimes we get confused, and it could be taken wrong in 2 different ways. One can take it as, oh, well, that's it's not right to think of someone as half a person. And then it can be taken the other way, where it's some fellows who, if they were brought up before they came to Krishna consciousness, if they have conditioning of a chauvinist, for example, they may then consider all women to be half a person. But what's going on here is intimate associate of Lord Chaitanya. Lord Chaitanya, although on the spiritual plane, she was definitely an intimate associate, because she was actually in Krishna Lila, she's one of Srimati Radharani's servants, right? And Lord Chaitanya is Krishna in the mood of Srimati Radharani. So on the spiritual platform, they have complete intimate connection. So there's not even a question of half a person. But since this Lila was taking place here, and Lord Chaitanya was a sannyasi and Madhavi Devi was a woman, they couldn't have the external relationship like the others could. And so when we hear 3.5, it may actually sound like an insult, but it's actually quite the compliment, because in any other circumstance, no lady would be able to understand that mood of Lord Chaitanya, but she was actually able to. So she couldn't be considered as an entire associate on the material platform, at least, but on the spiritual platform, everything was copacetic. So anyway, the only reason I pointed that out was because sometimes when people hear that, they take it in a way that it's not actually meant. So anyway, so Ramananda Roy is one of these. Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu advised Pradyumna Mishra to learn the science of Krishna consciousness, or science of Krishna, from Sri Ramananda Roy. That's another really interesting pastime. As Subala always assisted Krishna in his dealings with Radharani and Krishna Lila, so Ramananda Roy assisted Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu in his feelings of separation from Krishna. Sri Ramananda Roy was the author of Jagannath Vallabha Nataka. So there's a play that Sri Ramananda Roy wrote. That's the name of that. Thank you, Mataji, for bringing that up. And then one more thing I want to talk about before we before we stop for questions and comments. So during the time when Ramananda Roy was, oh, my window's moved. One moment, sorry. During the time when Srila Ramananda Roy was instructing Lord Chaitanya, that sounds strange, but that's what was going on the most the ultimate goal of life. There's this transaction between the two, as we read the summary of. And so Lord Chaitanya asks Ramananda Roy, please recite a verse in the revealed scriptures concerning the ultimate goal of life. And so Ramananda Roy starts with talking about Varnashram Dharma. One should act according to one's Varna and Ashram and worship the Supreme Lord. And the Lord said, okay, well, but this is external, give me more. So after that, then Ramananda Roy quoted a verse from Bhagavad Gita, whatever you do, whatever you eat, whatever you offer in sacrifice, right? Yad karosi, yad ashnasi. And Lord Chaitanya said, this is also external. So please speak further, right? Then Ramananda Roy, he quoted Sarva Dharman Parityaja, you should abandon all varieties of religion, just surrender unto Krishna, right? And then Lord Chaitanya again, it says, I'm summarizing from, this is Madhya 8, now we're right around 64-ish. So after Lord Chaitanya heard Ramananda Roy speak, he again rejected it, and he said, go ahead and say something more, go further, right? Then Ramananda Roy, he then did 1854, Brahmabhuta Prasanatma, one who is thus transcendently situated, realizes the supreme Brahman, and he becomes completely joyful. We touched on a little bit of that in today's verse as well. And again, Lord Chaitanya, he rejected it. That's external. Come on, give me the real stuff, the internal. So Ramananda Roy kept going. So he kept getting more and more intimate until then he actually started going through the rasas, being a servant, being a friend, being a lover, a parent, being a lover, like that. And finally, Lord Chaitanya wasn't satisfied until he was hearing about Srimati Radharani and also Radha Kund, right? So this conversation between Ramananda Roy and Lord Chaitanya, often the conclusion that some devotees get from this particular conversation is that Varnashrama Dharma is external, and therefore we don't need to follow it, right? And they'll quote this setting, and they'll say, well, you know, Ramananda Roy suggested it and Lord Chaitanya rejected it, so we don't even have to pay attention to it. We just have to pay attention to pure devotional service. All right. And so this is a common misunderstanding now, and it was a common misunderstanding long, long ago. Right. So Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he wrote a book called Bhakti Aloka. Bhakti Aloka is it's basically an essay, and it is his commentary on two verses of Upadekshamrita, the things that are favorable to devotional service and the things that are unfavorable to devotional service. And then also talking on those two verses of Upadekshamrita, he also gives commentary on the first verse of Upadekshamrita, which is, it describes one who can become a guru, who has complete control of the senses that are just of the mind's demands, etc. But in this book, Bhakti Aloka, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur brings up this pastime of Ramananda Roy and Lord Chaitanya. And so I'm just going to read from that a little bit, and then we'll discuss a little more. So Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur writes, Srila Ramananda Roy said that the process for achieving the supreme goal of life is given in the Vishnu Purana as follows. Here's the quote. One can worship the Supreme Personality of Godhead Vishnu by proper discharge of the principles of Varna and Ashrama. There is no alternative to pacifying the Lord by execution of the principles of the Varna Ashrama system. That's the end quote. Then Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur continues, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, however, rejected this process as external and requested him to give a higher conclusion. The purport of Sri Chaitanya's statement is this: O Ramananda, Varnashrama Dharma is meant to regulate the gross and subtle bodies. If someone is satisfied only in that, without engaging in devotional service of Krishna, then what is his gain? Therefore, although the process of Varnashrama is the only means of purification for a conditioned soul, still, it is external, right? This goes back to what we were talking about in today's verse in Srimad Bhagavatam, that one has to be sense-controlled, but that sense control actually has to be engaged in Krishna's service. Otherwise, what's the use of it? Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur continues, as stated in Srimad Bhagavatam 128, here's the quote: the occupational activities a man performs according to his own position are only so much useless labor if they do not provoke the attraction for the message of the personality of Godhead, right? So even if one is following Vedic injunction, if one is not following the purpose of the Vedas, which we know from Bhagavad Gita, Vedaischa sarvam ahameva vedyo, the purpose of all the Vedas is to understand Krishna. So if we're just following something that's written in the Vedas, but we're not doing it to actually understand Krishna, then this is, as Srimad Bhagavatam 128 points out, just useless labor, right? It may enable us to enjoy in the heavenly planets for a while, but it's certainly not going to get us back to Godhead. Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur continues, from this, one should not conclude that Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu has ordered us to discard Varnashrama Dharma. So Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, this was a problem even back then. He saw that this was going on. So this isn't anything new that we have this conception and so that we can do that. So he continues, if that would have been the case, then he would not have instructed all living entities through his pastimes of completely following the orders of Grihastha and Sannyas. As long as one has a material body, the system of Varnashram Dharma must be followed, but it should remain under the full control and domination of bhakti, right? So it has to be followed, but you can't lose sight of the actual goal, which is to understand Krishna. Varnashrama Dharma is like the foundation of one's supreme occupational duty. When one's supreme occupational duty is matured and one achieves his goal, then the process is gradually neglected, right? Then Varnashrama Dharma is less important. And then continues, again, it is also abandoned when at the time of death, right? That's when Varnashrama is abandoned. Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur continues, in the last half of the verse quoted by Srila Ramananda Roy, it is said, Vishnur aradhyate panta nanyatat toshakaranam. One should know that without following the process of Varnashram Dharma, a materialist has no alternative to pass his life favorably for the service of the Supreme Personality of Godhead Vishnu. This is the only way to achieve the life of a devotee. So he continues more. I recommend highly reading this book, Bhakti Aloka by Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur. It's available on, in folio anyway. I'm not sure if it's on Vedabase.com, but it's on, if you have the program, you can look that up. Another thing I will recommend, and I'm sorry I'm going over time, this is such good stuff. Srila Prabhupada actually wrote a book about Ramananda Roy and this discussion. Let me see if I can. It's called Ramananda Samvad, but it's also called, I had it open here. I think it's called The Ultimate Goal of Life, just taken from that quote in Madhya 857. I can't see where I have it. Oh, okay. I have it open here. One moment. Let me get up to the cover. Yeah, it's called In Search of the Ultimate Goal of Life, also called Sri Ramananda Samvad. So this book, a lot of devotees don't know about it because it's not one of the mainly the widely circulated books. What happened was B.G. Narasingha Swami in 1977, in Srila Prabhupada's room in Radha Damodar, he found manuscripts of this book in the bottom of a trunk, and it was in Srila Prabhupada's handwriting, unmistakably his handwriting. And there were, I think, 40 pages that were missing from that manuscript. And so the devotees tried for a very long time to locate those 40 pages. They were searching in various locations where Srila Prabhupada may have stored things, but they were unable to find them. So this at least was published to show this conversation. And this book, it's also very good. I highly recommend that. It really delves into, it's Srila Prabhupada's commentary on this, is extensive commentary on the conversation between Srila Ramananda Roy and Lord Chaitanya. Now, of course, we have his commentary in the form of the Chaitanya Charitamrita and then also in Teachings of Lord Chaitanya. But this, he really goes into it, and there are many fine details that come up. So that's another thing I highly recommend. Also, Madhya Lila 8, there's basically over 250 verses that describe this transaction between Ramananda Roy and Lord Chaitanya. It's such a wonderful conversation. The mood is fantastic. They have such a great relationship, so I recommend reading that as well. And unfortunately, we don't have a whole lot of time to really delve into it. But yeah, so I'll stop here. I'm really sorry I went way longer than I normally go, but we have 7 minutes if anyone wants to either share an appreciation of Ramananda Roy, or if there are any questions or corrections or anything like that.
Hare Krishna, Prabhu.
Hare Krishna.
Prabhu, I just really, like the point you point out, like for the violence, like normally we think when we think about the violence, like killing animals or something like that. But you said, like Prabhupada mentioned that violence is like whenever we know something, like we have some like we are situated in like Krishna consciousness, and when we see people, if we don't say about that, that is also considered violence. But when we reach people, Prabhu, then like if like about the book distribution, like when we try to like say, hey, you wanna read about Krishna, the Lord, then they will say like, no, I have like my religious book and all. So how can we like say that, like how can you reach them, like what can I say that like I cannot even explain to you. I do book distribution, but it is like so hard to like make them take the book sometimes. So how can we reach them?
So the important part here. So actually, first I'll read this excerpt. So this is from Bhagavad Gita 10. This is the purport of verses 4 and 5, where there's a list of qualities. So this one paragraph says, ahimsa, non-violence, means that one should not do anything which will put others into misery or confusion. Material activities are promised by so many politicians, sociologists, philanthropists, etc., do not produce very good results because the politicians and philanthropists have no transcendental vision. They do not know what is actually beneficial for human society. Ahimsa means that people should be trained in such a way that the full utilization of the human body can be achieved. The human body is meant for spiritual realization. So any movement or any commissions which do not further that end commit violence on the human body. That which furthers the future spiritual happiness of people in general is called nonviolence. So there are we have to understand this this concept, but we also have to be completely detached, right? So in other words, we give people this knowledge in whatever way they are able to receive it, but we don't become attached whether they take it or not, because most won't take it. They're not ready to take it, right? Whatever they are willing to take, that's what you give. So for some people, it's a book, which is fantastic. That's wonderful, good, because eventually they're going to, read it. They're going to get a lot of benefit. Sometimes it's just prasad. Sometimes it's hearing the Hare Krishna mantra. There's lots of different ways to give it, but that's how we have to use our intelligence. But we also have to remain attached because we're not the controllers. We can't make people become devotees, just like no one could have made us become aspiring devotees. So all we do is make sure that we're doing our absolute best to determine what it is that we have that we can give them, what they're searching for. Even if it means a conversation, we find out what they're looking for. We know that it's Krishna, and we could present it to them in their language. And then slowly, they can come closer to accepting actual Krishna consciousness instead of just certain aspects of it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Anything else? Kalpesh Prabhu. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna Prabhuji, please accept my humble obeisances. Excellent explanation related to non-violence and how to keep Krishna in center. I have a question related to book distribution only. And in many occasions, I have found that people use selectively when they don't want to engage in the book distribution. They say that Krishna told in the Bhagavad Gita that we should never give to the envious people. So like that's a very popular thing which people always say. And at the same time, when I see that people are in Kanishta Adhikari, right? And the idea is to go and progress in their devotional life. And that can only happen through the engaging into devotional service. So how can some can come up with overcome that mentality of Kanishta Adhikari to that other Adhikaris, the top other Madhyam Adhikaris or even the Uttam Adhikari? Because if one does not endeavor, right, and he and if one keeps on giving the excuse, saying that it is just that Krishna told that I should not give it to the envious people. Then I mean, then how do we really? Because everybody is envious in that way, in certain way, and then you are not doing anything, and that's is sometimes it could be an excuse, and sometimes it could be genuine too. We cannot say all the time it is an excuse, and it could be not genuine. But how do as a somebody who is into the devotee life, and he wants to, as you said in very well said in the starting, that one who does not give the Krishna is also a violent kind of, right? So so I'm just thinking like because people argue with me sometime on that basis, and then I, because it's spoken from Bhagavad Gita, and then they are also a Vaishnava and they are also a devotee, and then I don't know how to respond to those things, because it becomes like tough situation to explain somebody in that situation. Please, if you can enlighten on this topic. It's very important for me because I have faced a lot like this.
It is. So yeah, those who are Kanishta Adhikaris, it takes a bit for them to understand how to see Krishna and other things aside from just the deity and just the spiritual master. So that just takes some understanding. Oftentimes, through the association of devotees, we realize that we are also quite envious, but nobody gave up on us. And so we could see that, okay, so I shouldn't give up. And giving it to others just means making it so it's available. In other words, not keeping it to ourselves, because then that's where the envy part comes in, right? So if we have this Krishna consciousness and we're not willing to even try to make it available to anyone else, that's where the violence comes in. Now, if we see situations and we understand, okay, how exactly can I present this in a favorable, palatable way? that's what we have to become expert in. And for that, it does take becoming basically a Majjhima Adhikari. So through the purification of the process, we will get to that point where we can make those discriminations actually based on reality instead of based on our whim, right? Because the Kanishta Adhikaris, they're still discriminating, but they're just not doing it properly, right? The Majjhimas, you may even say from one standpoint that the Majjhimas aren't even doing it properly, because the Uttama Adhikaris, they just see everyone as equal, right? And that's really what's going on. On the spiritual platform, we are all equal, but we're not acting on the spiritual platform. Therefore, whatever platform everyone's acting on, we can discriminate based on that. And then, and not discriminate in the bad sense of the term, but, you know, to distinguish the difference between what can I do in this circumstance, what can I do in that circumstance, right? And so it takes a bit to become expert in that, but one needs to really understand Shastra, obviously through the Guru and through the sadhus, and it has to be a constant progress. We can't think at any point that, okay, now I understand exactly what's going on, I have nothing more to learn, and I am the perfect preacher because I can understand how to preach in every situation. If we get to that point, we think we are the center, and we're not Krishna conscious. So constant study, constant association with devotees, constant chanting like that will bring us to the point when we're actually, our intention is to just make Krishna consciousness available for everyone in whatever way that they can, whatever way they can accept it and benefit from that. Does that make sense, Prabhu?
Yeah, I have written down that, and I will go through that and meditate on it, because you said wonderful points, and I have to dive into depth of it, because you are talking all these experiences from the Shastras, and I will just try to read again and again and see what filters into my heart,
Jai.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. If there's anyone else, it's 9:03 now, but if there's anything else.
I don't see any hands up, but thank you very much, Prabhu, for parsing that purport so nicely. I'm just feeling more gratitude for Prabhupada today, and just being able to hear all that we have heard today. And everything is just comes together. And this conversation between Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and Ramananda Roy, before we had come back to the beginning of Chaitanya Charitamrita, we had actually gone through with Vishnu Gada Prabhu. And the clarification was just absolutely wonderful. And, about Varnashrama Dharma also, that was the other thing I was thinking about. All the rituals are all directed towards that end, but we have been so misguided and performed them, like you were saying in this purport, without understanding the purpose, without making that connection, renunciation without understanding where we should be actually engaging our senses. That is how we had been going through life. And now that we are here and have the opportunity to listen to Srila Prabhupada and understanding it the way we should actually understand, it's just all I can say is I'm grateful. I'm just not quite there, not fully understanding it yet, but at least I know that I'm getting the right information. And the other thing is, these are such big pieces of information, but he still thought we were qualified enough, like that 2.5 personality comment. Another guru might have said, you know what, these people are not going to understand this, so let me not even put this in the purport and make them misunderstand it. But he gave us that.
And it's not there often. It only comes up twice. It comes up here, and then it comes up when it talks about Sikha Mahiti and his sister.
Yeah.
And there's not really much of an explanation.
Yes. but we had the good fortune of today, you explained it, and that day when we were going through that purport, we discussed it for a little while about that, so that at least the people that were in the audience that day understood, very clearly, it's not that a woman is half intelligent. It is because of the time spent that, that's how it was calculated.
Yeah, the other points that you brought up about how we can become, with Varnashrama, how we can become distracted, how we can end up cheating, and all these things. All of that is actually addressed by Srila Prabhupada in that book, Ramananda Samvad. So I highly recommend it. It's so great. When I went through it, it just takes the points that we commonly misunderstand and just explains them absolutely clearly. Kind of like how Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur did in that Bhakti Aloka. Just that one paragraph showed that this isn't a new concept. Us thinking, oh, you know what? I just made this eureka thing. Like, we don't even need Varnashram because Lord Chaitanya rejected it. No, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur saw that coming, right? And he was like, that's not the mentality you have to have. You have to see that it is absolutely valuable and necessary for most people, but you have to do it in such a way that you're actually advancing in spiritual life, because you can do it in a way where you're still stuck in the material world, right? So one has to do it properly, but one has to do it as long as you're in the material world. One has to follow it. It is the tool to get out, but it has to be done properly. So yeah, just in one paragraph, he really nailed it. But then, we have so many arguments, counter arguments about different, circumstance, time, place, and we come up with all these things to think that, to justify why we don't have to do anything aside from what I'm personally comfortable doing, right? This is how we like to operate. But yeah, Srila Prabhupada squashes it, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur squashes it, Lord Chaitanya squashes it if we actually read through and don't take little snippets out of context. It's quite clear if we actually read it. But somehow these arguments keep coming up, and it's unfortunate, but at least it encourages us, observers of those arguments, to actually find out what's going on, and we learn more. And then, so all these things happen for a reason. Even the arguments are going on for a reason. So if we use those arguments to encourage ourselves to actually understand what the Shastra is saying, then, that's great, because then, we're going to get a taste of studying Shastra. And anytime we have any doubt, that's what we're going to go to, instead of, going by either popular opinion or, whatever else we go by. We'll actually go by Shastra. Instead of social media, we'll go by Shastra. Imagine that. It'll no longer be Google Sadhu Shastra, it's Guru Sadhu Shastra, right?
So the Veda base, what were you saying, folio? Is that
Yeah, there's a program. So there's the online database.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it has all of the books that are on the actual program database, but the program, I think now it's downloadable. You can put it on your computer. I think 2019 might have been the latest version. It used to be that you could get it just, on a CD. You would install it on your computer, and I think back then it was maybe $100, but now I'm pretty sure it's free. So
what it's called, Veda base folio?
We ended up calling it Folio because there's a program called Folio. It's a Windows-based program that it runs that format. So it's that searchable, but it's, we also call it Veda base. But yeah, Prabhupada Folio is one. But yeah, if you search for Veda base download, I guess, online, you can get that. And then it has a whole library. I think it's more than what's online, but I think the online one also is gradually putting everything in there. But it has like songs of the Vaishnavacharyas, other books, all the Back to Godhead articles, all the lectures, conversations, letters, everything.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
All right. No more hands up, so. Thank you again for a wonderful class. We'll see everybody tomorrow at 7:15 in the morning.
Okay, Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai.
Jai. Thank you, Chair Chandra Prabhu.